let me get started with you, Kate. As an academic on the topic of Australian defence industry policy, what do you see as the key challenges, risks, and opportunities facing the public-private partnerships to deliver defence, national security, and broader national resilience?
Thank you, Courtney. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. Thank you to Gabe Rotman and Justin Bassey and ASPI for a fantastic conference. It's been so interesting and informative, so it's a great privilege to be here to speak. And thank you for this important question. It's interesting when I was starting to think about a response initially, I was very drawn to the title of this panel, which is, it starts, "Industrial Policy is Back in Vogue." And it kind of made me curious, and hopefully in the spirit of some constructive debate, it did make me think about what the extent to which that is actually true. As we know, industry policy, particularly in defence, is a bit of a pendulum. We started in the 1960s and 70s with a lot of government ownership of defence industry and manufacturing. Then we had a huge outsourcing, as did many global partners across the world in the 80s and 90s. Swinging back a bit, I think in the 90s and early 2000s, as we understood the importance of sovereign capability. A bit of a conflict of interest myself, having been one of the authors in 2016 of the defence industry policy, where we really were trying to maximise Australian industry. So where are we now? Is industry policy back in vogue? I think, to my way of thinking, there are a couple of really key foundational pieces which would mean that you could say, yes, it is a success and industry policy is back in vogue. First of all, I would talk about understanding the importance of industry policy. And yes, I am a huge nerd, and it is my passion, and Courtney's going to have to stop me talking all day about it. But understanding that it's not just a bolt-on, that it is an enabler of national security. It has a huge impact on economics. Just the $55 billion alone spent on defence, a huge part of that is influenced by our industry policy and where we spend it and how we spend it. Just looking at the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines, what an enormous investment in our industry that will be, and the requirement for the uplift is extraordinary. And there's social implications too of industry policy. Do we understand, what kind of a society do we want to be? Is it manufacturing? Is it importing? Is it exporting? I'll just quickly go to a couple of foundational pieces that I think would make industry policy back in vogue. And with a little trepidation, I would say defence resources and funding. Now, the Australian Industry Group has made our own contribution to this discussion earlier in the year. And as a very passionate defence industry advocate, it is my responsibility to talk to that. And we would like to commend ASPI's contribution in their report as well. Our findings, looking at the portfolio budget statements and the public statements, is it is indisputable that there is a big pressure on the defence budget. That acquisition and short-term acquisition and sustainment funding and resources has been under pressure. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The nuclear-powered submarine is one. Inflation, workforce, estate, and our membership base. There are a lot of positive things happening in our industry base, but we do get a lot of feedback that the industry is under pressure and that the resourcing must match the capability requirements, including the submarines. The second part is skilled workforce. There wouldn't be a week that goes past where my membership base doesn't talk about the importance of skilled workforce. The innovation system and R&D, and we had a wonderful panellist in Vicky Thompson this morning talking that very issue. Later stage acquisition procurement, speed to capability, understanding what minimum viable capability is and delivering that. And finally, I do want to touch on governments and regulation. It's very important, we think, that there is a systemic and strategic view of government regulation. We've had very big changes through the licence for environment, which has been a wonderful win. It has also come with very, very significant changes to our export controls laws that we're still working through. and indeed the security aspect of that as well, and what it means for Essential 8 Level 2 across the sector. So they're kind of the foundational key pieces that I think would bring industry policy back in vogue.
Thank you, Kate. Oleg, over to you.
Friends, I'll start with some of the key challenges of government and industry working together. So firstly, they often work at different pace and different aims. You think about the procurement complexity, there are often lengthy and risk-averse defense acquisition processes. They deter innovation and reduce agility. You think about the red tape, the cost, the time, the effort of the various compliance matrices for a major bid, and it's quite immense and it's quite a big burden to private companies. There are often misaligned incentives. Industry prioritizes delivery and scalability. Government often prioritizes compliance and certainty. You think about talent shortages. Both sectors compete for skilled personnel, often the same pool of talent. If you think especially in cyber, AI, and systems engineering, to name a few. There is often lack of coordinated demand signals. Defense strategy documents are often very high level, so for industry, long-term requirements are opaque. Defense needs to clearly demonstrate its requirements so industry can match it with commercially viable business models. I think the challenge for the private industry is getting a long-term perspective on what defense requires and then carving out aspects of those requirements into capability packages of marketable size and time period for it to be attractive commercially. So these are the challenges, some of them at least. What do we think about the opportunities? So firstly, we are in a shared mission environment. For many years after the end of the Cold War, especially in technology space, and DroneShield is a technology company, defense was not what technology talent was going to do. Everybody wanted to go to Silicon Valley, where you have world standards, you have ethical issues that a lot of people struggled with. There was often a lack of purpose to defense. Now, as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others are challenging the established world order, that is starting to align, and now we're seeing again best talent coming back into the defense industry and defense technology. Dual-use tech leverage continues to be important. In the counter-drone space, in addition to defense, which is our main focus, there is, of course, counter-drone applications for terrorism, counter-surveillance, and so on. So customers also include civilian applications like airports, data centers, stadiums, and the like. You think about internet, DARPA invention, once defense technology, now mostly used in civilian tech. We should not forget about the shared defense infrastructure programs. You think about office towers around Canberra Airport. It's designed around defense, secure facilities, and so on, but there is spare capacity available for commercial tenants as well. It's important to take the learnings, and this is another opportunity, of the commercial sector from its deployments globally, like, for example, DroneShield is deployed in Ukraine, where we have quarterly software updates in response to the Russian drone threat that we're seeing, and then learning from that, and how can we take those lessons and ensure that defense are procuring the best available capability. And then lastly, and this will touch into the next speaker, our great friend Osamu in Japan. Australia can lead amongst trusted technology nations in building interoperable and secure defense systems, working together in terms of supply chain and training and so on, so having similar systems across the partner nations.
Thank you for that answer. If I could turn to Dr. Nishiwaki, as a key Australian partner, what do you see are the key challenges, risks, and opportunities?
Sure. Thank you. And first of all, I just would like to appreciate ASPI and all the participants for this opportunity. And well, as already discussed this morning, the world has rapidly changed from the age of globalization to this age of competitive strategic competition. And in that sense, as already discussed by Minister Conroy, that so many lessons we learn from the war happened in Ukraine, that, defense itself is quite important, but without the strong defense industry, there is no serious meaning for the deterrence. That has been fully shared in Japan as well. So in that context, we have certainly increased our defense budget with the targeting of doubling from the 2023 to 2027. We are on the process to increase the budget more than 10% per year. And also, as we in Japan, as already mentioned by our colleagues, faces quite a problems which we think it's a common problem shared by democracies, that a shortage of investment to the defense industry, or the labor shortage, or some problems with the supply chain and other issues. So in that context, in Japan, we have created a law established a law called Defense Industry Base Strengthening Law, which will give more support to defense industry, for example, including some investment to new production lines, or investment to the automation to counter shortage of our labor. So I would say, to the topic of this question, we can say industry policy is quite back because of such a change in global environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Glenn.
I think it's a really interesting discussion. We've been breaking sort of defence security away as if it stands alone, and I think we've heard that out of several of the speakers. But when the Minister for PNG and Minister Conroy were talking, they absolutely spoke about economic and security being intertwined, right? And Minister Conroy reaffirmed that. And I think what we need to understand is our national resilience doesn't stand as a separate topic. It stands as something that does require a strong industrial base, and it's interesting to hear Japan has brought that into law. And we've got to look at all of the sectors we need it in. And as Australia, as a country, we have to ask ourselves, as Minister Conroy did, do we want to chase a 3.5% target as Secretary Hesketh has done? We need to look at manufacturing technology, service industries like ours, healthcare, and create that strong industrial base that's going to support us from a defence and a national security side. We know that when significant turbulence comes, countries are going to look after sovereign capability. I'll just refer to the pandemic because we seem to have forgotten a lot of the lessons we learned. But, you know, America stopped a plane flying out of Thailand that had 3M masks that were going to Holland and put them on a plane to fly to the US. These are masks. We're not talking about weapons, we're not talking about security systems, we're talking about basic PPE. Germany locked out export of PPE and turned vehicles around at airports. If that's going to happen in a pandemic, what happens to us in a crisis? So the challenge, I think, is that we have to work out how do we get Commonwealth investment in capability that's Australian-owned and controlled, so that in the times of global crisis, be it a conflict, be it a pandemic, be it some other global crisis that's coming, we can self-sustain our responses, because we know we can't rely on others to the way that we would want to, be it a foreign-controlled board or a foreign interest. We've got a recent change into the CPRs, the Commonwealth CPGs, Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines, from finance and industry, that talks about 51% Australian ownership and an Australian-controlled board. But that comes in on 1 July, but Defence haven't committed to that. And we don't have a joined-up policy across that sovereign industry. So, you know, as an Australian and veteran-owned company operating globally, we see this an enormous opportunity for the military-civilian cooperation and how we bring that together. And we've spoken about how Ukraine has been a great example. 80% of all casualties on the front line in Ukraine are being treated in civilian hospitals. We've been working over there. Within 6 months, we will have trained 100% of all trauma surgeons across Ukraine in combat and field surgery. How we integrate that better to suit all of us is really, really critical. If we talk about risks, I think our greatest risk is time. We've been given a deadline, very, very clear, by China on what its plans are, and it is really close. And we need to move really quickly. The longer it takes us to translate policy into action, the more vulnerable we're going to be. So we could be easily prioritising Australian-owned and controlled capability, and we could exercise our military-civilian collaboration. We've done that in Haiti, where we're working with the government and the policing forces to try to help recover and re-establish the machinery of government there. So what are the opportunities? Well, I actually think the opportunities are enormous. The Commonwealth can easily demonstrate its commitment to growing that local capability with Australian primes that are ready to stand up and invest and build, because we need to know that if we invest and build here, that we've got time to see that recovery of that investment. I know Aspen itself will be strengthening our own capability soon by offering a national defence and national security capability where we bring in all of the threads of what we've operated globally to bring in. And I think there are many Australian companies that want to do the same, but we need to see, as was spoken about in the last session, that consistency and a long-term view to what we need and want from our industry, not just in a defence environment, but in a national resilience environment, and how they tie together. Thanks.
No, I think that's really valuable. And I often read in the deterrence space that deterrence is backstopped by a credible combat, a credible combat forces. But I think it's also, it's a necessity to have a credible industrial base with sovereign, secure supply lines. Otherwise, how are we going to last more than a few days in any crisis? Let me transition back to Kate. Kate, I think you've addressed it a little bit in the initial response to your question, but just more specifically, if I could pull on one thread, what should the objective, more pointedly, be of industry policy to support national security, and what specific levers do you think that government can pull to support sovereignty?
Thank you very much. Another important question, and building on the excellent comments from my colleagues on the panel as well. I think importantly it is critical to actually clarify what your objectives are. Sometimes I feel like we sort of just have vague things about maximising industry and supporting a sovereign base, and they're fairly vague. We actually, and I would commend a report that the Australian Industry Group wrote in partnership with the Australian National University at the end of 23, and it was about defence industry in national defence. And an important part of that was developing an industry as a strategic capability in its own right, rather than just a bolt-on again. And an underpinning of that was a clarification of your objectives. So there is a spectrum, right, from strategic objectives, we're only going to, intervene in the market where it is a capability issue, right through to economic objectives. We're using defence spending to, just focus on workforce and jobs and so forth. Of course, there is a spectrum, and it's a complex spectrum. We have quite a number of companies as members who say to me, look, we actually built capacity through economic objectives, and that allowed us to create capability. And I think the Joint Strike Fighter supply chain was a very good example of that. So being very clear on your objectives, understanding that your economic objectives can feed into strategic objectives, and where you want to sit on that spectrum. In order to facilitate that, and again, there's some very good comments from the panel about how do you do that? What are the big government levers that you can pull to create that sovereign industry, which allows it to be part of your force projection, which allows you to surge in a time of conflict, which allows to be a real asset in a time of conflict. And I do think it's important to distinguish between the pull and the push, if you're familiar with those terms. So the pull of capability, industry into capability, that's where you get huge payoff and huge benefits through things like the Australian Industry Capability Program, where you are setting benchmarks, where you are driving capabilities. I hate to mention there was an ANAO report on AIC, but nonetheless, there are some very positive things in that program, and that's a very good, illustration of a government lever. The push elements tend to kind of dominate talk about industry policy, but to my mind, they are important enablers, but they're not the foundations. So things like grants, we talked about, I mentioned the cyber security requirements, which we have absolute respect. We've had discussions about that today. We must support particularly small to medium enterprises to meet their security requirements through grant programs, through those enablers, the setting up of the strategic sales office will be an important part to support exports. But it is the big fundamental structural changes that pull industry through, that set expectations. That's what makes the difference for industry policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. I really appreciate you kind of framing it for the audience, because, industry policy, it's not always the sexiest topic, but it's a critical topic that I feel like is completely not appreciated, because if you do just skim the surfaces with phrases, that you don't get into what the nitty-gritty is, and it's the work that needs to get done. So thank you for raising those. If I can, Oleg, go to you. What do you think is the realistic role of Australian industry in supporting continuous defence operations, and how can a government-industry collaboration be enhanced from your perspective?
Industry provides agility in capability development. It allows faster iteration and innovation in traditional defence-led programs. Local companies are also important for surge capability. It's a significant body of additional capacity, and defense often can act as a scaler of innovation. So smaller businesses can create innovation like AI-based ISR or EW, and then defense through larger scale development can essentially mature a lot of those technologies. Industry often takes adjacent roles in things like engineering, maintenance, field support, that enables a more leaner and deployable defense force. If you think about the Royal Australian Air Force in 1980s, that was about 25,000 personnel. Today it's approximately 15,000, yet it's a essentially much more effective fighting force, and that is because it's having the industry that has taken a significant maintenance roles as part of that. And of course, a lot of defense personnel are reservists. We at DroneShield employ quite a few, so that brings that dual capability value. In terms of the improvement of collaboration between defense and the industry, continuing to work to create one team as opposed to us versus them sort of mentality is important. And as I was mentioning earlier, to have those clear pipelines for future collaboration, because it's important for the industry to have that long-term transparency. We need to continue to develop opportunities and forums where warfighters and senior defense officials can collaborate with the industry. For example, we have been in the US, even though we're an Australian company, for basically entire period of company's existence for 10 years or so, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for the counter-drone industry, it's right since the inception. And there, what we're often finding is there are, you can call them industry test days or perhaps other means of testing where the industry gets brought onto the tent with defense. Defense does extensive amount of testing on topics of interest to them, and then there is ongoing one-on-one conversation with the chosen suppliers, sharing of intelligence from defense, which enables them, those suppliers get better quickly, as opposed to suppliers trying to guess in vacuum what's of interest to defense and matches their requirements. We have also been fortunate enough, as an example of collaboration that works really well, starting about 5 years ago, to do electronic warfare work with the Australian Navy, where the EW Department of the Navy essentially did a roadshow around Australia saying, hey, if you never worked with us before, please write to us. It was a public tender at the time, and tender in a sense of application to the Navy's EW team, and let's have a conversation and see whether what you do is of interest to us. And that's how what is now a 5-year collaboration with the Navy's electronic warfare team has started and been going really well, starting with Gate 0 contract and now through multiple additional contracts. It's important for defense to engage with the industry as early as possible, so the industry can then best contribute to defense capabilities and the depth. And then in terms of the clear pathways to procurement, so many of you will know about the concept of valley of death in defense, where it takes a long time since when the industry gets going, a company is established, and when it can finally sell to defense. So that's about simplifying access to defense panel arrangements, streamlining export support, and we talked about the AIC mechanisms as well.
Thank you. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I'll wait because we have to get to the other ones. I might follow up after we get through a few more. If I can quickly go to Dr. Nishiwaki, I wanted to ask you specifically, how do you see export controls and national security regulations shaping Japan's approach to defense industrial partnerships, and specifically as a result of Japan's 3 principles of the defense equipment transfer? What might happen to Australia and Japan's defense industry relationship? If you could explore that, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to our strong civilian side industry, I think Japan was fortunate to have a reasonably strong defense industry that can produce from missiles, tanks, to naval ships. However, as mentioned already by Courtney, that as we had this export control and strict export control on defense equipment, so most of the, I think I would say, both the consumer and the investor for our defense industry was the government of Japan. This very much shows maybe the opposite side of today's topic, how the policy affects the industrial behavior. So I think it's a good example. And as already mentioned, in Japan, not just we increase the defense budget and also establish our defense industry base strengthening role, but we also reviewed our export control system, in particular these 3 principles, so that we can more engage with our allies and partners, including countries certainly includes countries like Australia, to have a stronger partnership in defense industry. If we look into the whole universe of the Japan-Australia economic relationship or industry relationship, I think we have a tremendous strong tie or integration of the 2 economies already. I mean, today there's some company sponsorship from a company like IHI or MHI, but I think they have been in Australia for more than 50 years, and I think in civilian side, and many other Japanese companies are also in Australia for more than half century. So I believe that there's no reason why the Japanese and the Australian defense industry can have or cannot have that kind of a strong integration of the supply chain. And and I believe already some cooperation has been happening. And just give you some example, my colleague next to me, this DroneShield, are already coming into the Japanese defense market. And I think vice versa is already going on, that the Japanese defense companies are coming into the Australian market. So if I just conclude, I think again, the government policy gives quite a lot of influence to the industry's behavior, maybe more than we think. So the adequate industrial policy would be quite important to have a strong supply chains among the allied or like-minded countries like Australia and Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. Glenn, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm actually going to give you 2 questions. Now, based on your last response, and just building on that, Aspen Medical's delivered critical services from some of the world's most challenging environments, and I've read about them. It's just really spectacular, the services that you've provided, including health crises, humanitarian emergencies, and defense operations. And just to be more specific, from your perspective, what do you think are, if you're going to pick 3 key ingredients of a truly resilient, public-private partnership, especially for, in particular, rapid mobilization in crisis conditions, what do you think those 3 key ingredients are? And next, I was going to ask, from your experience, what do you see as the role of industrial policy, evolving to support dual-use capabilities?
Yeah, look, thanks for that. I think if I had to pick 3 ingredients, right at the top of that list is planning early. So getting in, preparing, putting systems and contracts in place, methodologies to cooperate and work together. So getting that in advance rather than panicking the day after an issue. Then just doing the planning and preparation and getting out, exercising each other. When we all sign contracts, it's all sunshine and light and we're all happy. But when you're around a room trying to make stuff happen, even if it's an exercise, that's where the rub points come, and that's where we start to learn how can we be better at what we're doing and more efficient. And then the final one is around trust and cooperative decision making. So being willing to say, walk in, because you've got a pre-existing arrangement in place, because you've done your planning and prep, you can walk in and say, right, I've got a problem coming up with this, or, you know, can you help us make this decision? I'll give two examples. One, so we are currently, Aspen Medical is the only emergency medical team certified by the WHO in the world that is a commercial entity. There are 49 countries and NGOs that are emergency medical teams. We're the only commercial entity in the world. So they did that in 2017. They plan, they get an agreement in place. We do trauma surgery, infectious disease and outbreak, and they've just asked us to move into rehabilitation. We plan with them. We go on exercises globally. We do all of that. We don't do any exercises or planning in Australia. We're one of only 2 EMTs in the country. So that's an example of that preparation, planning, advancement and working together. Now, can we do stuff at short notice? Absolutely we can. Yeah. During the fall of Kabul, we were asked in 72 hours to set up a hospital from scratch to take 450 refugees, which ended up supporting Five Eyes and taking 4,500. It worked at such short notice because we were willing to trust the government that a contract would come. It took 6 weeks, we got our contract, and they were willing to work with us on what support we needed to be able to roll out. Defence, DFAT and ourselves worked together in a way that was truly collaborative. But then we stopped. We didn't say, well, how do we put that in place in the future? And so, you know, I think there are opportunities in our current defence procurements. You know, if I look to our area, you know, I know we get excited about very, very high-tech and complicated kit. If we wanted to talk about stuff that we use every day, JP 2060 is the mobile modular health facility that Australia's rolling out to all of our services. There are lots of opportunities. We know we're going to take that into the Pacific. We know that's going to support perhaps earthquakes or crises in Southeast Asia. But we're not actively out there saying, right, we've built this great industrial base, we've built it here, we're training on it, we're operating it, why aren't we finding ways to get it to be operational in the Pacific? You know, America and Europe does this really well to operate out to us. How do we do the same with our industrial base out to there? To talk about then to the dual use capabilities, I think we've got to stop talking about civil and mill, as I said in the first question. Got to find a way that these just interact every single day, right? The DroneShield talks about what it does every single day. We could be operating drones in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia in ways that support surveying, health surveillance. We do amazing work as a nation in many other areas that will support our Pacific neighbours around education, around health, financial systems, machinery of government, digital enablement, that will support us when we need to step out for a military or a security operation. The mini-lateralism idea that's been spoken of by ANU, which is saying, let's not try to bring 45 countries into a room, let's bring our Pacific neighbours in Australia in, let's bring our Asian neighbours in together and work together in a mini-lateralism model where we are buying and swapping and supporting equipment, is really critical. I'll just touch on one final point, which is we do seem to still have a disconnect between what we want to do to drive our economy and what we want to do to drive our defence sustainability. We have a Defence Exports Office we heard about, and yet we don't have a policy that drives buying from Australia. How we can expect foreign countries to buy Australian if Australia doesn't buy Australian is a really, really challenging sell when you're sitting in the room. And so finding a way to bring those two together, it strengthens our military security aspects, it strengthens our economy and allows for a much tighter blend of MIV-SIL operations.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm just cognizant that we're getting close to lunchtime and wanted to check the audience if they had any questions. If you could please identify yourself and your affiliation, and please provide a pointed question. Thank you. I think there's one here in the middle.
Thank you all so much for your comments. This was such an interesting panel. Sarah Pavillard from Adroita. I think the question that I want to ask is it time that we move from a policy settings to actually legislating what we require from our industrial base? Policy is discretionary. I just think I'd like to hear from the different panellists on that.
Did anybody want to take that first? Kate.
I'm happy to lean in. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and a great question and an important question. I know there has been various debates about whether we legislate content and capability versus policy. Probably from our perspective, we think legislation brings with it many challenges as well. There would be some positive elements, which I can understand where your question is going. I guess in terms of the challenges with it, it's lengthy. It can be, once that legislation is in place, it's difficult to change it. The policy can be more flexible. So there are some benefits there. I think the strengths would be in, as I said, kind of pulling those government levers as an ecosystem around AIC, around that continuum from innovation through capability, through export, understand the ecosystem of what the primes bring, growing that mid-tier section of the industry base, which is in the Defence Industry Development Strategy. But to my way of thinking, it needs to be matured more, how that's going to work, and then bringing the SMEs through as a critical part as well. So to my mind, that's the best approach.
Can I just add something to it? I think legislation's hard, all right? Rules and regs are much easier. We can take legislation that's pre-existing, we can establish the rules and regs, and allows government, as the strategic scenario changes, to be able to tweak and adapt that. At the moment, we sit there with guidelines, right? And guidelines everybody looks at and goes, it's more a guideline than a rule, and move on, right? So rules and regs holds them to something without the straitjacket that legislation would create. So I think there's a real middle ground for us. We can move much quicker. And look, the strategic environment's changing so fast. Go back 150 days ago, no one would have thought that, you know, within 2 years, the world's aid programs will be half of what they were at the end of last year. That's massively impacting into the Pacific and Southeast Asia, into the support networks that we typically want to expect to draw on. We can quickly pivot with a rule and reg change, and then if need be, change again. Thanks.
That's a really good point. There's a gentleman on table 19 here.
Thanks, Andy Keogh. I note from Saab Australia, I note the ongoing discussion there has been across and debate across Australia and Australian industry about foreign primes in Australia, and given my my employment at Saab and Australia, and Saab being a global, I'll stay away from that one. But a sort of follow-on question from that is, if we're going to take taxpayers' dollars and we're going to invest in strategic national capabilities, should we therefore require those companies and Australian companies to be listed companies? So there is an element of transparency and responsibility and rules about how they operate, how they report to the market. And what's more, it also means that Australian taxpayers can, if they think that company is going to receive great largesse and going to be highly profitable, they can actually invest in, buy shares in that company, and therefore benefit from that. And a good example of that, and the best example, would be something like Austal. Listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, open, transparent, has to report to the market, has international operations, has been extremely successful in obviously the US operations as well. So I just pose that question to the panel.
Can you repeat that company's name?
Austal.
Oh, Austal. Sorry, I didn't hear.
Yes.
Thank you. Anyone?
I feel I should probably take this, given I run one of 3 Australian public listed companies of any size, together with Austal and Cath2, and the board is here, and EOS. We've been listed for about 9 years, and it's been an insanely difficult journey. Public markets do not like opaque, lumpy cash flow businesses, and we are arguably, of course I'm biased, significantly undervalued because we are public compared to if it would be privately held. Now, it has its own advantages. You have essentially guaranteed liquidity if you know what you're doing. So last year we raised close to $250 million to assist with our expansion and so on. But I think most people, frankly, screw it up, and there are a lot of examples of public listed defense companies that for various reasons should probably never been listed. So I think that if Australian government is to give awards to Australian companies, and hopefully there'll be many that will compete, so you're not just giving it to a monopoly essentially, that does not need to tie into public ownership unless on a standalone basis it makes sense for the business to list. I would see them as two quite separate things.
Glenn?
As a privately owned defence company sitting on the panel, you know, I thought there was a great comment by David Gonski last week about the requirements on directors for all companies, public and private, have got to a stage to be so onerous in regards to disclosure, in regards to transparency, and in regards to responsibility, that when we often get asked, do we want to list, and we've looked at others, the answer is don't list in Australia, go to America. So I think it'd be a great way to ensure that there are less defence companies that are sovereign in Australia by driving that requirement. And I say that respectfully as one of your subcontractors.
All right, I'm going to take the last question, unless there's anybody that wants to arm wrestle me for it. I'm looking out.
There's one way over there.
All right, go ahead.
Hello, Trevor Thomas, Defence Executive Advisors. Once upon a time, I'm in robotics. Once upon, I was working with the Naval Group for submarines, and we had a good opportunity there for a short time. I've moved then to the Hunter destroyers, and they were very interested in our robotics then too, but then we were told that the funding would move for 3 years, so come back in 3 years' time. There's a lot of people who have these issues. What's happened is, in the end, I was tipped into Canada, and we sold our robotics to the Canadians, who have now resold it to the United States Navy. What is it short-termism? Is it systemic failure? But why is it that we end up sending all our technology over to other companies when I first went to defence, people weren't interested in our technologies. So in the end, the whole thing went overseas.
Oleg, did you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So I think historically, in my experience, there has been mindset within defense that anything that is good is made outside of Australia. So I remember in the early years, we often been asked by defense, so, you know, how are you guys going? How are your prototypes coming along? And we're like, no. We have thousands of units deployed in Ukraine. We have all of the US government agencies buying from us. We're not talking prototype phase. And that would be shock and amazement. I think now it's starting to change with defense understanding that Australia does have world-leading technologies. It's not all US, Europe, and Israel based, or Japan based.
Yeah.
And for example, in the counter-drone world, we now have Land 156 program, which I hope will be awarded to a sovereign Australian entity. And there are others similar to that where capability exists. I think defense will prefer to give it to Australia. I think there's a separate adjacent issue, which I, for lack of time, won't go into, in that we have a lot of what you'd call tier 3 capability, which is essentially making sheet metal, plastics injection molded parts, etc. And then you have basically nothing in terms of tier 1, because that's truly all overseas primes. But what you really need, I think, to eventually get a tier 1 capability is to foster tier 2 capability, which is where, for example, DroneShield, but a number of others like others under the SAPA, so Ostel and Macquarie Tech would be fitting. So it's a gradual process, but I think the tide is changing from what it used to be.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one quick question to wrap up our panel. Dr. Nishiwaki, you have so much experience in Japanese AT&L, and I just wanted to ask, what kind of lessons can you impart to the Australian audience on your experiences around the defense industrial partnerships?
Well, I'm not at all in a position to say any kind of lessons to a great country like Australia. But, well, I think maybe related to the last question, what important is the kind of a long-term relationship between the government and the industry may give some kind of a prediction or predictability to the industry side about the continuous investment. So that I think we are learning in our system that rather than to be too short-cycled, to give a longer-term vision to the industry about the defense equipment development and procurement. So that kind of thing is something maybe of interest to other policy makers. And also, again, some kind of a, as this has been the topic of this session, I think in this new age, we need a new partnership between the government and the private sector. And we need a strong transformation, as mentioned already, in a very quick manner. So in that sense, I think some kind of a governmental assistance, as I mentioned earlier, that we have now strongly supporting the automation of Japanese production, defense production process to counter our labor shortage. But that kind of a strong assistance and the vision shown from government may be worth thinking to pursue adaptation of industry and also the government to this very difficult age of strategic competition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of the panelists. This was incredibly insightful, and I think the reality is that we need to evolve. The partnerships must evolve if we're going to continue to attempt to meet the requirements of our environment. So if you could all join me in thanking the panelists.